The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the show. Tonight's topic is a bit of an ideological one, the role of the budget in furthering social justice. To discuss, we've invited to our studios Dr. Ahilan Kadiragamar. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna. Good evening and welcome to the show, Dr. Ahilan.
Good evening and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. To start things off, if you could give us your views and perspectives. To enable economic recovery and political stability in a country, the policymakers need to act collaboratively with all its stakeholders, including academia, including professionals, civil society, trade unions, with the common objective of working towards enabling and ensuring the best protection of the rights of the peoples of the country. How are we faring in this respect?
I must say that we are really faring poorly, for the reason that, first of all, we have to understand what the people are going through. In a nutshell, if you look at our economy, it's going through the worst economic crisis since the 1930s. And last year, our economy contracted by 7.8%. This year, there's another contraction. People have lost jobs. According to the World Bank, last year, 500,000 jobs were lost. According to the construction sector, 1 million jobs were lost. A survey by the UN's FAO said that daily wage earners, their incomes came down by 50% last year because they don't have daily wage work anymore. But cost of living, and particularly food inflation last year, was 100%. So in other words, they had 1/4 the amount of money to spend on food. So that's the baseline with which we have to start thinking about how are we going to engage the people, what kind of budget, what kind of economic policies. But we are not hearing this from the government. They are hardly paying any attention to the devastation that people are facing. So I think this is a moment when we as a country, whether we are professionals, policymakers, really have to take stock of all of this and try to bring about a major shift in the direction of our economy. And we are talking about the budget today, and there's very little in the budget to address these kinds of changes.
The IMF Governance Diagnostic Report, which was recently released, also alludes to all the issues that have taken place, as well as certain recommendations. So what if the government were to turn around and say, look, we are trying to make things better. Yes, we are in a crisis, but we are trying to make things better with this budget. What is your reaction to that?
Well, if you actually look at the budget itself, as I mentioned, the major issue here is the economy is in free fall, right? And when there's a contraction like that, now, over the last 4 years, I would say our economy has contracted by 20%, right? A developing economy like ours should be growing 5% at least every year. That's not happening. So the main issue is how are we going to dig ourselves out of this crisis? And during a contraction like this, private actors are not going to invest. You know, if you look at Sri Lanka's economy, on an average year, investment, it could be public investment by the government or private investment, or you and I could build a house, that's also an investment, should be somewhere around 30 to 32% equivalent to our GDP. But in a contraction like this, the private sector is not going to invest because the market is shrinking. So the government has to take the risk and invest more. So in previous years, if they were investing 6-7% a year on the average, this year they should be investing much more. But in fact, if you look at the budget, public investment next year is only going to be 3.6%. Even that, I think, will probably not happen because the Treasury won't release the funds, because we are in this straitjacket with an IMF agreement where the IMF is demanding that Sri Lanka have a primary budget surplus next year. What does that mean? That our revenues should be higher than our expenditure. But when the economy is in free fall, it's very hard to get revenues up. So in reality, what would happen is that our expenditure would be further reduced, which means there's less money going around, less in terms of incomes. So coming back to the governance diagnostic, for example, that address one particular problem of corruption, right? Of the kind of structures of governance that we need. But that's not going to solve the economic problem of how do we expand our economy, get growth back on track, because that is what's going to decide on how much incomes families have to be able to put food on the table.
In your opinion, what are the missteps that are being taken as at now?
Well, I think the government really needs to rethink its economic plans, because what we do during a crisis has to be very different from what we can do during normal times.
Sure.
Right? So now people have lost their incomes, we are seeing malnutrition on the rise, school dropouts, a health crisis with our hospitals being abandoned. So we need to focus on social welfare. We need to focus on rebuilding our society, right? Because people have been devastated by one crisis after the other. The COVID crisis and now the economic crisis. But the government seems to be completely insensitive to what the people are going through. So first of all, there's no relief at all in this budget for people. That is what we need so that people can slowly start recovering. So what is there in this budget? I would characterize this budget as a budget that just is merely serving commercial interests. You know, under the rubric of investor-friendly reforms, in this budget, they're going to bring about, the president says this in his budget speech, 60 new laws and amendments. That's almost a new law and amendment every week. Is that what we want? Whose interests are they serving with these legal changes? And keep in mind, these laws are going to be passed by a parliament that has no legitimacy. I mean, there were the huge protests last year. People have called for elections. They say, well, we don't have funds for elections. But the same parliament is busy passing laws. And can we carry the people with these kinds of laws? So what kind of future are we looking at? There's no relief to the people now, and there's really no vision for the people for their future.
Do you think there's an alienation between the government on the one hand and its stakeholders?
Definitely. So I think this budget, much of what the government is doing is really serving the interests of a small elite in Colombo and maybe the other towns. But they really have abandoned the people. And then, of course, they are pandering to the interests of maybe commercial interests abroad, and particularly because we defaulted on our debt last year, the creditors, right? So they're bending over backwards to serve the interests of creditors, particularly bondholders. But in terms of, so even if you look at this budget, you know, the government has been very critical of what they call money printing, which really means expanding government debt. But the president has come out and said that they are going to increase the debt ceiling by something like 3.5 trillion rupees, just so that they can repay the creditors. So that is also money printing. So they're happy to do money printing to serve the creditors, but they're not willing to do anything to support the people, to provide them relief, and to find a transition out of this very deep crisis. Otherwise, we stand the risk of losing a generation. This is going to be a very long, protracted crisis. If you look at the IMF program, which we are locked into, you know, they're saying, you know, next year, even the government has said we would only have 1.6% growth. Now, even that is questionable. Even the IMF program over the next 4 years, and after that, they're only looking at about 3% growth per year. You know, that is very minimal for a developing country. On the other hand, the IMF says allocate 4.5% worth of your GDP for debt repayment, right? So we're only going to grow 3%, but we are going to be spending 4.5%, which is about 30% of our budget, to repay debt. The government is not bargaining with the IMF. The government is not negotiating hard enough with the creditors to be able to put our economy on a sustainable path. They are just putting the entire burden on the working people. You would have heard about domestic debt restructuring a few months ago. And what did they do? They have cut the retirement funds of our working people, right? My estimates are that in 16 years' time, the retirement funds of working people, let's say if they are 40 years now old and they're going to retire in 16 years' time, their retirement fund is going to decline by 47%. What will they have for their retirement, right? So this government is not sensitive, not sympathetic at all to what the people are facing, and they're only concerned about what they're calling investor-friendly policies, right? And whether actually investors would come is a big question, because Sri Lanka is in such a deep crisis, right? They are continuing in this sort of mythical belief that somehow investors are going to come and save Sri Lanka. When this hasn't happened over the last 2 decades, would investors come during a deep crisis like this? We have to first put our house in order, right? To get people to a level that they can survive. But that kind of thinking is not there with the government and not there with the IMF, because the IMF represents the interests of very powerful actors abroad and commercial interests abroad.
Let's talk a bit about social safety nets, which have been provided for by the budget. Are you saying that the Aswasuma allocation, for example, is insufficient, or are you saying that the safety net needs to be widened? If you are looking at this in a solution-oriented manner, what more needs to be done?
Yeah. The allocation for Aswasuma, or what they call social protection, which is how the IMF agreement was sold. They said, the IMF agreement is going to bring a lot of hardship, but in turn, we will protect those who are affected, right? But if you look at the allocation for Aswasuma, it's only 0.6% of GDP, right? And that is more or less what we were doing even before that. Right? During the COVID times, actually, we were allocating close to 1.2% of GDP. In other years, we've allocated around 0.4%. So it's not much of a change in terms of the allocation. Then they bring up this story that we're going to target better, right? We're going to actually find the poor people and give it to them. What happens during an economic crisis? Today, the farmers are affected. Tomorrow, the fisher folk are affected. The next day, the construction workers are affected. 68% of our working people belong to the informal sector. They don't have a regular income. So how can you might target somebody today, and then tomorrow the situation is different. Now, Sri Lanka was actually an example some decades ago to the world, where as a country, even though our per capita income, in other words, our GDP divided by our population, so the GDP per individual was very low, our human development indicators were very high. In terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of nutrition, because of universal social welfare policies, free healthcare, free education, and up till we shifted to these open economy policies until the 1970s, we also had a free rice subsidy. So at least people won't starve. Imagine now if we had something like a rice subsidy for everyone. Not everyone will use it. Only those who really need it, because they have to go and get it every week. Only they will use that subsidy. And if we had something like that, at least they won't have to worry about starving. They can rest assured that at least they can not go hungry the next day. So we've done this before. But now we are importing these models of economic development, which are really piling the burden on people. Internationally also, there's a lot of discussion about this, right? What is the right way to move forward? And the world is looking at Sri Lanka, and there are 2 ways in which people are thinking about it. More of this market-oriented policies, more of serving the commercial interests and hoping somehow that things will trickle down, right? Or starting to think about more robust systems of social protection, social welfare, and unfortunately, I think we are taking the wrong path forward.
All right. We are in conversation with Dr. Ahilan Kadiragamar. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
TV1. TV for life.
Mahinda Rajapaksa explains why he will support the budget.
අපිට මාවත් දෙකක් නැහැ. අපි හැමදාම ඉන්නේ ජනතාවගේ මාව.
Chaos in Parliament after opposition leader comments on the Supreme Court ruling. State Minister Sanath Nishantha snatches Sajid's papers. ICC says Sri Lanka can continue to compete internationally. Cabinet green light to send the draft of the Broadcasting Regulatory Commission bill to the legal draftman.
අමාත්‍ය මණ්ඩලය විසින් මේ මූලික කෙටුම්පත පිළිබඳ අනුමැතිය ලබා දුන්නා.
TV1. TV for life.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back. We're in conversation with Dr. Ahilan Kadiragamar. Dr. Kadiragamar, we are talking about the role of the budget in furthering social justice, which encapsulates the concept of equal rights and equal opportunities and equitable opportunities for all. I'd like you to focus a bit on the work you do in the north with the rural communities, the farming and fishing communities in particular. Speak to us about the kinds of initiatives that are ongoing and the resilience of the rural communities in the north.
Yes, Sonali. So over the last many years, I've also served in my voluntary capacity as the chair of the Northern Cooperative Development Bank, which is a federation of the 1,200 cooperatives, fishing cooperatives, dairy cooperatives, agriculture cooperatives, Palmyra cooperatives. So it's all about rural livelihoods. And we've been giving direction to these cooperatives because I think one of Sri Lanka's strengths is the cooperative movement. During a crisis, it is people coming together, working together in the countryside and trying to support each other, but also take forward their livelihoods. And with COVID and now the economic crisis, in the north, we are seeing people turn more and more to local institutions. You know, transport costs have tripled. So you can work locally in your village, but you need marketing facilities. But then you have to, many small producers come together in a cooperative and they're able to take it forward. So, and that is how they can build some amount of resilience. Because otherwise, during a crisis, prices fluctuate. Even if you take the price of rice, you know, it almost doubled suddenly when it drops. So then either the consumer is affected or the farmer is affected. So how can you bring producers together and serve the interests of people? What I've found encouraging in this process is that increasingly I'm also seeing young people get involved in cooperatives in the north.
Right.
I do some research also in the hill country in Norelia district, and again, you know, some of my own students, some of them for the first time from their states have come to Jaffna University. And while, you know, a lot of young people are also thinking of leaving the country, I'm also seeing young people who are taking on the crisis, working with cooperatives, bringing their technical knowledge to be able to better the products of cooperatives. And this has really been inspiring because I think out of such a deep crisis, a kind of once in 100-year crisis, who's really going to make a difference are the youth. if there's going to be any change in this country, it's going to come from the youth. So in this sort of acts of solidarity and the hard work of young people, working with rural communities, with actual communities involved in production and livelihoods, I see a lot of hope.
When we speak of the transformative nature of youth and education, I'd like to focus your attention to the FUTA's work, the Federation of University Teachers Associations. You're its vice president. FUTA has long campaigned for 6% of GDP to be allocated for education, but at present the education budget stands at under 1.5% of GDP. Speak to us about how problematic this is and what needs to be done. If advocacy and campaigning isn't going to do it, then how do we go about enhancing the paradigm of education in the country?
Absolutely, because as I mentioned earlier, one of Sri Lanka's real strengths has been education, with a free education policy. But over the last few years, again, we've seen this allocation investment in education greatly decline. If you take the universities, allocation for the universities came from 0.6% of GDP, now this year, next year, to something like 0.25% of GDP. The capital expenditure, which is really what is the investment, right? Recurrent expenditure is about paying salaries. The capital expenditure is what is investment for the future. If you take our universities, it has come down from 0.16% some years ago to now 0.2%, almost zero. Right? So the government has abandoned our universities. It has greatly reduced the allocation for general education, which means our next generation could suffer, right? But I think people are still not fully aware of this impact. So the first thing is, I think it's really important that, because education is not just about teachers or lecturers, it's about the future of our society, it's about the next generations. So we have to really create awareness and put a lot of pressure on the government that education is something that we can't abandon now, because if we do, it's going to be devastating over the next many decades in terms of the kind of society we are going to have. Now, I think next month, as the President mentioned, there's going to be a debate in Parliament about certain reforms they're going to bring to higher education. They want to get rid of the University Grants Commission and bring about a National Higher Education Commission, and to initiate private universities, fee-levying, profit-oriented private universities on par with state universities. And we know what will happen. It's the same lecturers who are going to also work there. So all the lecturers, all the resources will be poached from the state universities, and then education will become a privilege of the wealthy, right? So it'll completely change our society. So these kinds of concerns have to be brought up, and the people have to really demand that this is unacceptable, right? We have to focus on what is there for our future, and we have to start with education. We also have to focus on food system and agriculture, because these are the basics, right? No point saying that investors are coming if our people are starving, if our children are dropping out of school. What kind of economy or society do we have then? But I think people are struggling with their day-to-day concerns. They are struggling with putting food on the table the next day. So they can't seem to think far ahead. So I think intellectuals, opinion makers in this country have an important duty to make people aware, and to, while meeting the immediate challenges, also preparing for the future.
What is the way forward, in your opinion, with respect to ensuring that the budget in fact does enable some sort of social justice?
I think in terms of the direction that this government is taking, the kind of laws that they are pushing through, not only many laws in relation to the economy. They suddenly want a new law on land, on fisheries, on banking, but also they are trying to bring about many repressive laws. The anti-terrorism bill, the online safety bill. So they are bringing all of that because they don't want people to challenge the direction in which they are going. So therefore we have to really take them on in terms of through awareness and in fact even protest if necessary to change the direction of the government.
Dr. Kadiragamar, as the Vice President of FUTA, which is the trade union representing the country's academic community, what role do you think you have to play in ensuring that all the stakeholders of education work collaboratively with the government towards enabling and ensuring that the country's education system and higher education system is properly streamlined, is not sabotaged by commercial interests? What role must FUTA and other stakeholders play collaboratively?
You know, Sonali, in a crisis like this, all of us have to work together, right? University teachers, school teachers, trade unions, all sorts of people's representatives have to work together to get our people out of this crisis. Unfortunately, my view is that the government is not playing a constructive role here. The budget reflects that. And if the government is not going in the right direction, it's important for us as representatives of social organizations to set the government on the right path. So that means we have to debate ideas, we have to give proposals, alternatives, whether or not the government is going to take it forward. And if a government does not take that forward, out of a crisis, we might even have to change the government to be able to move forward. It's not about any political party per se, but it's about the direction of the country. We owe it to our people. They have worked hard for so many decades, and now we are going through an economic crisis. We can't just abandon them, whether that's what the IMF wants us to do or whether that's what the international bondholders want us to do. We have a responsibility. Our prime responsibility is to our people. And this is a time for FUTA, for academics, and I think teachers also, because school teachers are there in every village, right? For us to work together with the people to come up with solutions from the people, right? When we sit in some capital city and think this is how agriculture should be, it doesn't work. You have to work with the farming communities, the fishing communities, and bring out their concerns and solutions. Now, if you take land, for example, one thing the government has is a lot of land. But what are they doing with that? They want to give 300,000 acres of land for agribusinesses. Imagine if that was given to 150,000 families at 2 acres a family. At least they will be able to feed themselves. But that is not what the government is thinking. So on each of these issues, we have to find the information, come up with alternatives, and challenge the government to implement programs that benefit the people.
Dr. Kadiragamar, I feel like we have to leave our viewers with a hopeful message, since the entire conversation was quite depressing.
Yeah, these are difficult times. But Sri Lanka has also gone through difficult times in the past. In the 1930s, we went through a malaria crisis just like the COVID crisis. In fact, worse, we lost 2% of our population, right? But we came out of it. How did we do that? Out of that crisis, we decided that free healthcare was important, free education was important, that a food subsidy was important. So we created the policies, which is what strengthened our society. So we have to take this crisis on. It is our responsibility. It is a challenge for generations, and we have to meet that challenge. And I think the youth have an extremely important role to play in defining a new path forward.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Ahilan Kadiragamar. Thank you for joining us for the first time.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.